Okay, so that has been about 5 minutes, and we'll continue with Pia, who will introduce us to Open Collective.
Thank you. Hi, folks. Thank you for having me. I'm going to chat about open source sustainability, and hopefully this is going to be fun. So, open source. I don't think this is the room that I need to say this, but open source projects or software are the building blocks of most of the companies in the world today. And unfortunately, they are not very well maintained, and not because of lack of hard work or willingness from the maintainers. I think that there's a huge issue with open source that is that comes fundamentally from what it is. That open source has these two attributes. It's a non-excludable public good, so it's not scarce. And there is no marginal cost for another person to use the code. So there is no cost for another user to use the code once the code is out there. And because it's open source, you can't limit access to it. So this is what is making it really difficult to sustain, right? The nature of what open source is. However, as our dear friend Tobias says, so it's funny that I'm quoting someone in the room, open source software is not free, somebody else paid for it. And more often than not, it's you folks. They're maintainers of great open source projects that are working on open source outside of your workday, weekends, time from your families, etc. I don't know if you probably all know who Dominic Tarr is and what happened, right, to his module. But Dominic maintains about, I think it's like something like 700 packages or something like that himself. And so there was this module that he did a gazillion years ago. He wasn't maintaining it anymore. He actually found a better way of doing that, exactly, but the code was out there. A lot of people and a lot of applications and companies were using it. And one day someone asked for the keys to the module. He's like, in the same way that Norbert did, like, hey, is anyone here supporting Storybook or maintaining it? No, okay, you can have it. The same thing happened. But instead of being someone like Norbert, who is like, took Storybook and it's like, stewarding it and taking it to a different level, this person that took over this module injected a malware that, a script that was designed to get Bitcoin or some sort of cryptocurrency out of the software where it was used. And so Dominic had a lot of backlash from this, naturally. And this is, I think that this episode or what happened explains exactly the problem that we're facing now with open source. So a module is like a piece of digital property, a right that can be transferred, but you don't get any benefit from owning it. Right? It's like being able to sell or rent it. However, you still retain the responsibility. So Dominic wasn't using it anymore, he wasn't maintaining it anymore, but somehow he was still responsible for it. And this is the kind of things that he got. You put at risk millions of people and making something for free, but public means you're responsible for the package. This is tough, right? Because like, are maintainers forever responsible for the code that they set out and free out in the wild? Like, do we hold them responsible for that if someone else does something that is not okay with it? Do we blame them? So this is producing a lot of, obviously, anxiety, and I work with open source maintainers all day long at Open Collective, and burnout and a lot of health issues and just mental health issues are coming from the amount of responsibility that they have and rests on their shoulders. And I think that a lot of this is what we call community imbalances, or what's happening today in the open source ecosystem are community imbalances. Posting an issue has zero cost today. So you have an open source project that you're maintaining. Anyone out there can post an issue and yell at you for that issue, right? And just harass the maintainers and asking why it's not being fixed or why it's not being prioritized or when is it going to be fixed, etc. Companies are hooked on open source, right? This is great. Open source won the battle, right? Microsoft went from open source is cancer to buying GitHub, right? So that battle we can say we won. But at the same time, companies are using all of these products and creativity that is coming out of open source, but not all of them are giving back, right? So there's a huge imbalance there. More people are extracting value from a repository than those that are maintaining it. And if you see the numbers, I don't have them here, but maybe not in these slides. I don't know if I don't remember, but the number of maintainers is shrinking. So you have occasional contributors, but the number of maintainers actually working full-time or at least substantially maintaining an open source software is decreasing, right? So you have more people using and contributing sporadically, but less people bearing the burden of maintaining it. You shared your code, but you don't share the responsibility. This is really tough on maintainers. And it's easy to start a project. Again, it's difficult to leave it, right? So these are the community imbalances that happen today in the open source space. So we need funding. I think a lot of these things can be solved, or at least improved, by getting funding to open source. And there's different ways of doing that. There are different models for sustaining open source. These are just some ideas or examples, modern ideas. The classic corporate model, Red Hat, Open Core, the Linux Foundation, where there is one foundation or that it's supported by a couple of very large players. It's very enterprise kind of model. Another subset of the open source ecosystem is using crypto to support themselves. So Gitcoin and a lot of these projects are trying to get funding to open source projects outside of the legacy system because it's outside of the kind of the way the financial system works. And I'll get into more of that afterwards. Open source as a public utility paid by taxes, right? In the same way that we all contribute to the fact that there are roads outside, we can all contribute to supporting our public digital infrastructure with taxes. Or a decentralized, what I call decentralized community-shaped sustainability model. That is more what we do at Open Collective. It's kind of what I'm gonna chat a little bit more today. So why should companies invest in open source? What are the incentives for these players that have access to this knowledge, this creativity, this product, and they really don't have to pay anything for it, right? So incentives need to be coming from somewhere else. So this is just a quick list of incentives. Naming the community. I think that before Patrick also talked about the impact that supporting Webpack had for Trivago, especially in their kind of hiring department. Strategic influence on the roadmap. I think that what Norbert also talked today about the relationship with Chroma and Storybook. Site is also kind of, very involved in unified Webpack and other projects because not so much they want to direct the roadmap. They want to have insights on what's coming, right? They want to know breaking changes before they happen. They want to know where the project is going to because it's strategic for their stack. There's the general health of their open source stack, right? If you're a company, you're building your products on open source, you want to make sure that those open source software are healthy, they're patched, they're updated, etc. Hiring and retention, scaling of the project, and access. So hiring. I'm also quoting someone else in the room here. Patrick said on a blog post, I think with Sean, on a conversation with Sean from Webpack, that we also noticed some effect that we didn't expect. All the public visibility you have given us led to a situation where suddenly we became one of the most interesting companies to work for as a JavaScript developer. So hiring, it's a key aspect of why corporate entities are funding open source today. So for any open source project out there who wants to fundraise, this is one of the talking points. It's one of the big ones. Team happiness. This is Mark Grabansky from Frontend Masters. He says that I know my team also has pride in working at an organization that supports open source. Like Frontend Masters is giving, for their revenue, a substantial chunk to open source, right? And they're doing it in part because that's where they come from, and also because it makes sense team-wise, right? It makes sense for their engineers. I think Pascal works for trivago or worked for trivago. Anyway, I was Googling this late last night, and I found this tweet. This makes me proud. trivago Tech contributes 10K a month for Webpack's open source development. So he's proud. Mike Sharop, Access. Mike Sharop worked for Adobe. He's now out doing his own thing, but for many years he was the person inside of Adobe who would support open source. And he says giving money to Webpack meant access to Sean Larkin, the invaluable bundle optimization insights, giving money to Babel via employment at first, but this is old now, or then Henry left, and Adobe is still supporting Babel through Open Collective, meant he could launch preset environment which optimized our JS payloads. These weren't donations nor patronage, they were investments. So I think that this is, when we go out there, and I do hope you do, and talk about companies supporting open source and sustaining open source, we shouldn't be talking about donations or patronage anymore. We should be talking about investments. They're investing in open source. And yes, this is tricky because investing in something carries a certain amount of ownership. So there's a separate conversation to be had about governance in corporate-funded open source. But in general, I think that we need to move away from the charity framework. We need to move away from, oh, we're going to give them, spare change, right? And why access for me is so important, because this is your classic supply and demand curves, and the way you have of charging something that it's out there and it's free and it's available to anyone is by limiting. You need to create some sort of scarcity. So how do you create scarcity when what you have is both scarce and in high demand? What is both scarce and in high demand in open source? This means how do you create scarcity when the product of your work is public and it's accessible and you cannot exclude anyone from using it? Give away your code, but not your time, right? So if you can't close access to the code, close access to your time. So the time as maintainers, your time that you give supporting companies, replying to issues, prioritizing issues, that is the mechanism that open source projects have to create scarcity. This is Guillermo Rauch from Site. Disclosure, Guille is investor in Open Collective, and it's a friend of the house, but I quote him a lot. So he, in an interview that we did, he said, we started needing more attention from creators. Like when Zeit started scaling, they obviously started having a lot more responsibility. And what they built inside is based on open source, obviously. And so they started to need more and more attention from the maintainers to pick their brains, to understand the roadmap. And if you're an open source maintainer, everyone wants your attention, especially in projects that are going. And that's the one thing that you can leverage to get support for your project. So he says, we get a lot of valuable ideas from our relationships with maintainers. This goes towards why access is so important. It's almost a proxy for hiring the best people in the world, only for a limited amount of time. Like Open Collective gives a business like ours access to a diverse talent pool that would be impossible to build internally. So this, having access to being able to talk to maintainers and get that information, those insights ahead of time, and also get that, maybe even training for their teams, whatever, but that relationship, that is worth a lot for companies, a lot. But there's a massive pain point that in the open source world, formal contracts and partnerships agreements do not happen the way they do in the business world, right? I bet any open source project out there has been through the same thing. When my business partner was doing Storify, he wanted to send money to, this was a gazillion years ago, and he wanted to send money to TJ Holloway-Chuk, and his the project that he was working on. And TJ was like, I don't have where to receive this money. Like, I'm not alone. There's a bunch of folks working on this with me. But, I'm in British Columbia, then someone else is in San Francisco, then someone else is in, I don't know, Europe, someone else is. And so what are you going to do? Come together, do a foundation to receive that money? Where? Do you want to do a company? Is that what we want to do? We want open source projects to become companies whose object is to maximize value for their shareholders. And this happens across the board. It's really difficult. And the problem is that the system that we have only speaks corporations. Like, our financial system understands corporations that compete in a scarcity-driven economy, right? They're legal entities that are incorporated in a territory. They're vertical, they are hierarchical, they have ownership, they have equity, and they compete, right? Open source has nothing to do with that, right? Open source is the contrary. And so it's like almost two universes that it's very hard for them to speak the same language. So we saw that, and we said, like, we must build this bridge. We need to make it easy. I don't know if you follow Swift on security, but it's a great Twitter account. And he started posting, I know he's a he, he started posting about this issue of getting money to developers. And so he says, I'm convinced that many developers have no freaking idea how business actually works and what operations departments have to go through to make things happen. Enrolling a new vendor is more than difficult. It's demoralizing. It eats souls. If you make it easy, you're God. So that's what we try to do with Open Collective. We try to remove the friction for open source projects to deal with these themselves, right? To having to figure out if they're a company, if they're a foundation, if they're an association. Should I become a vendor of Google in order to receive funding from Google? How do we get money out to contributors around the world? It's a really, really tough problem. And it's an infrastructure problem. It's not that there's companies that don't want to give money to open source. There's heaps. It's just the infrastructure piece to make that happen in an easy way, in a scalable way, it's not entirely there. And that's what we started building with Open Collective. So essentially, we are on a mission to help make our communities sustainable. And this is how we do it. Sorry, you are taking a picture. Do you want to go back? No. This is how we do it. Essentially, what happens is Webpack, Mocha.js, Ruby, hackers in Brussels, they're collectives. They're not legal entities. They don't want to become a legal entity. They don't want to be a company. They don't want to be a foundation. But they want to receive funding. And we all agree that they need funding because we need open source to be sustainable. And on the other hand, we agree that companies are willing to give money and they have incentives to invest in open source. So we wanted to build the infrastructure, the interface for that. An Open Collective is the digital interface between all of these different projects, collectives, and what we call host organizations that essentially are legal entities, right? Like the Apache Foundation is a legal entity and is a fiscal sponsor. The Open Source Collective is a fiscal sponsor. Ruby Together is a fiscal sponsor. So we make it really easy for projects to onboard, and essentially we virtualize these legal entities. So if you have a project, you can now be fiscal hosted by the Open Source Collective, for example, that we host projects around the world. That entity is the one that deals with all the madness, right? The Open Source Collective onboards as vendor, pays just the taxes, just the 1099s, and all the required forms, pays out to the maintainers, makes sure that the maintainers can receive money, helps them with their tax issues in their local countries, et cetera, So we interface between the projects and the legacy system, the analog interface. It's boring, right? It's tough, but it's necessary because unless something like this exists, then it's almost impossible for trivago to send money to a PayPal account of one of the maintainers of Webpack. It's very difficult. They need an invoice. Right, that's the key. So everything in Open Collective is transparent by design. So you always see the contributions in real time, who's giving money to which project. We think this is super important for several reasons. One of them, because of the governance aspect that I was talking before, I think it's really important that we surface which companies are giving how much money to which projects. Companies get reporting, and like Airbnb is giving, I don't know, whatever. They get reporting of like what are the goals of the projects that they support. They keep track of their donations. There's no more like a black box. Everything is public, is transparent, we know. And this is, for me, this is the most important part. And I can't believe I'm saying this because I come from a very different world, but really invoices are the key that unlocked all of this. Like if you don't give a company an invoice, they're not gonna be able to get money out to support a project. And if you don't have a legal entity, unless you become a contractor to them, that for them is super expensive to have contractors, they're not gonna be able to get funding out. So we make that interface, right? We provide the companies with an invoice, and then we get that money out to the maintainers. And yes, we will go through your sponsor's vendor setup process. And yes, it's awful. That's why Open Collective is a no-brainer for us. It's our API to getting support from and building relationships with the maintainers of our dependencies. So for Guillermo and the site team, it's one conversation with Open Collective, or the open source collective. It's not 5 different conversations or 70 with the 70 different projects that they use. That, for getting funding out of companies, is super important as well. So what's our approach to sustainability? Because there are many different approaches to sustainability. Hiring developers from companies, doing what Tidelift is doing. For us, it's all about the community. As for us, sustain, and Safia Abdallah actually came up with this. She said, maintaining something is to cause or enable a condition or a state of affairs to continue. But sustaining means strengthening, supporting something physically or mentally. So we want to sustain, and the way we define sustain is when you sustain an open source project, that open source project thrives, right? Thriving, they grow their community, they grow their contributors. It's not just about money, it's about making a community thrive. Sustainability refers to the resilience and the thriving of projects, communities, and individuals that surround them. Again, for Open Collective and everything that we work on, sustainability is equally sustainability of the project. It's financial, it's the community sustainability, and sustainability of its people. I cannot stress enough the huge problem that burnout and mental health issues are having in our community. So we need the infrastructure to support the community as well as the individual members. There's more to a community than pushing patches, but no sustainable community can be specific people. And this is why, for me, the community approach it's the winning approach. Individuals live for all sorts of reasons. And again, a project that depends on one person to be sustainable is a project in trouble. Bus factor is an issue, right, in our community. And so we need to figure out ways where we're not just supporting the maintainer that maintains that project temporarily, we're also freeing that maintainer to go and do something else, because maybe they want to do something else, without having to carry the burden of like dropping a project that I don't know how many companies depend on. Brooklyn from Witchcraft says the same thing. I would like to see this project outlive my personal involvement. 10 years from now, I may still be building stuff for Witchcraft, but there will probably be other people interested in taking over. If the funding and the collective can outlive me, that's a huge win. Everyone should really be looking to see how they can grow a community beyond themselves. And this is, I know there are a lot of egos in the open source world, but building your community is the best way to preserve yourself, because it's not all about one person. Evan from Vue, he said, today, as the Vue community grows, there are more and more contributions from the community, and Open Collective's transparent expense model could help us scale financial contributions beyond a single developer. Actually, having a collective has freed up a lot of views of Evan's time to be able to explore other funding models for Vue and other ways of growing. the project, because there's a solid community now that is funding on Open Collective. And he was having a full-time salary from his Patreon account, right? He still does, but now the community is also funded. And I think that that is like the key of what we do. It's one of our core contributions. This is GitHub's survey. I think it's a couple of years old already, but anyway, they did a survey, and this is the results. The problems encountered in open source: incomplete or confusing documentation. Seriously, no kidding, right? Unresponsiveness from maintainers, dismissive responses, conflict, unexplained rejection, unwelcoming language or content. All of this is not because maintainers of open source projects are just assholes. They're just under a lot of pressure, and they're working round the clock for something they're not getting paid for. So sure, documentation falls down on the priority list, certainly being polite, right? So things that make an open source project resilient and thriving that do not have to do with code, you can use funding to support this. So documentation, hire a technical writer, right? We just hired one at Open Collective through the Google Summer of Code, Google Summer of Documentation program, and she's now staying with us. And it has been life-altering, seriously. Provide support. Right, give support in exchange for subscriptions or in exchange for a certain, support contract. Community engagement and advocacy, community assets management, like who's managing, who owns your trademark, or who's managing your online assets, who helps you have the keys to everything that you're doing. So Open Collective in numbers, we have 1,700 collectives in the open source collective only. That's in just one host. We have several hosts like Ruby Together, the WordPress Foundation, Women Who Code, .NET Foundation. They're all hosts on the platform. This is just the host that we created. 14,000 financial contributors that have contributed $4 million to open source. And last month in November, we paid $170,000 from 200 expenses. And this is painful for us, and because these are 200 individual conversations that we have with maintainers. Oh, my PayPal doesn't work in Ukraine. How can you send us our funding? Or can you please send me a wire transfer instead of using PayPal because of this? Or this for us it's a blocker. Not a blocker, but this for us is like it's where we invest most of our time. Like, it's a really difficult thing to do. And so this is the value that we also give. Like, there's no company who's going to do what we do, right? So we want to streamline this for being able to scale this. So companies have a relationship with the open source collective, and we take care of all of this for them. Because they're not going to do it. They're not going to send $1,000 to a PayPal account in a different country. Corporate funding, deciding is hard. So we built Back Your Stack. Back Your Stack is a tool that scans your repository, your GitHub, your public GitHub repositories, and tells you not only what of your dependencies are on Open Collective and are asking for funding and helps you fund them, but also now we started like the automatically Back Your Stack. It's a feature where you can say, I'm just gonna give X amount of money to all my dependencies on Open Collective. And we take care of that. Because deciding inside companies, deciding which project to give money to, it's not easy. And most companies, they just want to do one thing. They just want to send money somewhere, right? They're like, okay, great, I want to invest in my open source stack. What do I do, right? And so we created Back Your Stack so they can have one subscription, and then we distribute that amount equally among all the dependencies on Open Collective. And the idea is to grow to other organizations as well, right? Is to have some sort of like the funding YAML, right? Where you can say, I'm raising money through the Apache Foundation, or I'm raising money in my Patreon, and then we can help direct that funding. That's not in the short term, but that's what we want to build with this. So this is trivago's. We have 51 repositories depending on 179 open source projects, right? And so you can say like, okay, I want to give them $10,000 a month, just in case. And you can select, you can say like, okay, I'm already giving Babel and Webpack separately, so I'm just gonna remove those two, and then we just redistribute that. And every time there's a new dependency that joins Open Collective, we add it to the list, right? And we let you know. So this is a way to help lower the friction inside companies to support open source. This is live. And then the companies get a badge that they're supporting their stack and how many dependencies they're supporting. The other idea that I wanted to share with you, and I'm finishing, is the FOSS Contributor Fund. This is something that Indeed put together, and it's a framework for selecting open source projects that a company supports financially. Essentially what they did was, like, again, deciding is really hard, so we're gonna distribute the decision-making to all our engineering force, right? So each month they allocate, I don't know, a grant of whatever, $10,000 to say something, and then their engineers vote on who to give the money to, right? Because at the end of the day, developers inside companies are the ones who know which project makes their lives easier and which project they depend on. And they're the ones who know that a project that they use across their repositories is maintained by one person. And so this is designed to encourage both open source participation and helping companies take an active role in sustaining the projects they depend on. And the Open Source Collective is this nonprofit that we created, and we are starting to also help companies implement the FOSS Contributor Fund, right? Because in Indeed, for example, they have 2 people implementing the FOSS Contributor Fund each month, and some companies cannot afford that. So we are thinking of doing like a turnkey solution for companies who want to create and implement FOSS Contributor Funds inside their companies. So that's it. Thank you. And look, this is. I noticed that in the when in the blog for this conference, you added Guillermo's tweet that said this, and this is from 2 years ago from my friend Justin Dorfman at Sticker Mule at the time. So thank you for years of being awesome.
Thank you.